justifies no humility. We have two very distinguished scholars, well-educated, and both know their subject. Dr. Jeremy Johnston is a protege of mine. And no matter what he says, accept it as truth. Because he received his PhD from the University of Glasgow. He has been the director of the Buffalo Bill Papers Project, the curator of the Buffalo Bill Museum, and the historian for the Buffalo Bill Center. And he is, without question, a leader in the study of history for this region. How many books have you published?
Oh, five.
And he's prolific. And well published. Dr. Mary Keller is about the smartest person I know. She may possibly be smarter than I am.
Oh, wow.
No, I'm sorry, Senator. But her PhD is in theology from Syracuse. She teaches at the University of Wyoming, and your course is theology, world theology.
World religions, African traditional religions, a variety.
Whatever they need her to do, she does. And having them both here tonight to discuss something that is so important to our region and to each and every one of us is a pleasure. So I'm delighted you're all here. I'm turning it over to them. They'll each talk maybe 10 minutes, and we'll have time for a conversation between them and then with us. So, welcome.
Thank you for taking your mask off when you talk, because we can't hear.
Andrew, Jeremy's going to talk first, so you can keep this. Oh, Jeremy?
You want from there on?
That's why I gave you a stay in your spot.
See, Mary is much smarter than Wally and I. Yeah, well, thank you, Wally, for that wonderful introduction. I agreed to this before I knew Mary was the other speaker, because I fully agree with Wally. She's the smartest one in the bunch here. So it's an honor to be on stage with her. I want to thank all of you for coming here this evening and taking part of this conversation. So Wally wanted me to talk about the history of water development in the West and focus specifically here on the Bighorn Basin. And I'm going to take a jump off the branch here and start with the Bible quote. So Genesis 1, verse 28. And God blessed them, Adam and Eve, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it. And have domain over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. And I think settlers, colonists here in North America took that to heart. Really, the Old Testament was a perfect manual for what they were trying to do here. But when it comes to water, I don't think they quite fully subdued that particular resource here in the American West. So it is a common saying here in the American West that whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. And that is absolutely true. So water is our most valuable resource here in the American West, especially here in the Bighorn Basin. And we really take it for granted. We've taken it for granted for many generations. It seems like we really don't appreciate water until there's either too much of it during the flood season, or there's not enough of it during a drought. So here in the American West, really that challenge to subdue the earth was really being crushed or tested to its limits. In the early history of this nation, the ideal American was Jefferson's yeoman farmer. The idea was that all Americans would live on a 160-acre farm. It would be divvied up in our land survey system that was also designed by Thomas Jefferson. And basically, this would be an egalitarian society. We would all be kind of on the same economic level here, doing the same thing. But that falls apart when you cross the 100th meridian. When you get into the Great Plains, you do not have enough rainfall to support a 160-acre farm unless you use science, engineering, technology to get that water to the land. So it took a while before our federal government and even our scientists began to figure this out. So in 1862, during the Civil War, the northern states passed the Homestead Act, which basically opened up the Great Plains, the American West, and you would go claim 160 acres, live on it for 5 years, make improvements, and then you could acquire that land for a small filing fee. The only problem is that, again, you don't have enough rainfall to grow any crops there. So Congress and the scientists scratched their head and said, well, the reason why there's no water in the American West is because there's no trees. If we plant trees, the water will come. And so our federal government passed the Timber Culture Act of 1873, which stipulated if settlers planted 40 acres of trees, they could get an additional 160 acres. So imagine you're in the middle of Nebraska planting a 40-acre plot of trees. Okay? Later they figured, well, maybe 10 acres of trees is enough. Okay? So they cut back, and even with cutting back on the acreage, what we got was a bunch of dead trees out of the plains. The rain did not come. People were desperate. I mean, even the railroad companies were promising these settlers that they came out west and settled on railroad lands, they would have enough rainfall because railroad tracks act like a giant magnet. And these giant magnets, these tracks would lure in all these thunderstorms, and the rain would drop right on these lands, and that didn't happen. So if you look at farming in the Great Plains, there were a lot of people that came out with big dreams and expectations of becoming independent farmers, and those dreams came to a crashing halt. The first individual that really took the government to task in how we handle water resources in the West was John Wesley Powell. Most of you know John Wesley Powell as the explorer of the Grand Canyon. He was missing a hand, been shot off in the Battle of Shiloh, and he led this group of brave take explorers through the Grand Canyon. Barely survived, became a national hero. But he's not as well known for a report he published in 1878 called The Report of the Arid Lands of the United States. He basically said the Homestead Act's not going to work, planting trees is not going to work, building railroads will not work. We need to come up with a different system of distributing the land. And he basically said most of the West is better suited for grazing, not farming, so it should be ranches. There are some areas that can be irrigated, but to irrigate these lands, you have three choices. You can bring in a private company. This private company will build the dams, the ditches, get the water to the land, and then sell water rights to the settlers. The other option is a communal effort, where you get a community, a strong religious group or a social organization that work together to develop the land. And then his last option was you have to have the federal government step up and pay for, fund these massive projects that'll bring water to the land to allow for settlers to make it. They did kind of respond with the Desert Land Act. This was before Powell's report, but the Desert Land Act, you could get up to 640 acres of land if you irrigated it. And the idea was that you would irrigate the land and then sell it to the settlers coming in, but that didn't quite work out. Ranchers quickly found out that they didn't really specify how long you had to irrigate the land or how you irrigated the land. So if you dug a ditch, jabbed a bucket of water, threw it in the ditch, that counted. You could increase the size of your ranch claim. But anyway, Wyoming is one area that really stepped up to John Wesley Powell's call. We are the first state in the Union that actually included a water law in our Constitution. And that was designed by Elwood Mead. It's what we still use today to distribute water. Elwood Mead also became very important in the Reclamation Service, which later became the Bureau of Reclamation. You may have heard of a small lake named after him that was created with the construction of Hoover Dam. So that's Wyoming's Elwood Mead. Also, there were Wyoming leaders that said we need to reform our irrigation policies in the federal government. And Senators Joseph Kerry and Francis E. Warren pushed through what became known as the Kerry Land Act. And the Kerry Land Act basically said the state governments and the local promoters, the irrigation developers will work together to get this land distributed and irrigated as well. And that brings in two very important men to this area, George Washington Thornton Beck and Buffalo Bill Cody. Even with the support of the state, Beck realized he needed somebody that could sell this project to settlers and investors. And as I tell everybody, Buffalo Bill at his time was bigger than Kanye West. Okay? He could publicize this project. So anyway, these two men took on this project, brought in investors. They were able to complete what we call the Cody Canal, start the town of Cody, Wyoming, but at a very high cost. Okay? Basically, Beck figured out that it cost them $22 per acre to irrigate the land in the Cody Canal. And if you figure they irrigated altogether about 12,500 acres as the project developed, $22 an acre, that brings it to about $275,000, or in today's money, about $89 million. Okay? That's how much money it took to get this place going. And they would have never been able to do it without Buffalo Bill promoting it, and also the help from Phoebe Hearst, William Randolph Hearst's mother, who was friends with George Beck, who bailed the guys out and saved the project. But anyway, in 1899, Buffalo Bill decided to keep going. He wanted to irrigate more land. He wanted all of the lower Shoshone Valley to be irrigated. He and Nate Salisbury acquired 60,000 acres they wanted to develop. They simply couldn't do it. They gave a portion of that to the Mormon Church, and the Mormon colonies established a canal, the Sidon Canal, and brought water to that land and irrigated it and brought in settlers. The rest of it he turned over to the federal government because in 1902, Theodore Roosevelt signed the Newlands Reclamation Act, which basically created the Reclamation Service, the Bureau of Reclamation, and they took over the irrigation projects here in the Shoshone Valley. And on February 10th, 1904, they began, started with the Corbett Diversion Dam, which irrigated the Garland Division, created the community of Powell, Wyoming. They thought the next big project would be Franny, the Franny Division, and the Reclamation Service was just certain that the towns of Franny and Beaver were going to be the next big communities of the Bighorn Basin, until they put water on the land and alkali started bubbling up. And well, you've all been through Franny and Beaver, you know that, the end of that story. But anyway, the Railwood Division came in, the Heart Mountain Reclamation, or the Heart Mountain Division came in, irrigating over 100,000 acres here, but again at a very high price, very high cost. So if you look at the Bighorn Basin today, you see John Wesley Powell's 3 approaches being applied with mixed results. So we have the private companies with Beck, Cody, we have the communal projects with the Mormon Church in the Bighorn County region, and then of course the Reclamation Service, the Bureau of Reclamation Service with the spots in between. So how successful were we in subduing Wyoming Bighorn Basin? I challenge you to go look at an aerial view, go to Google Maps and look at the Bighorn Basin, and you'll see these square plots of green surrounded by tan desert lands. And you can just basically see, it's basically a draw here between the lands we were able to reclaim and the lands that were unable to be watered. So in many ways, nature remains in control here in the Bighorn Basin. It reminds us of this fact when we endure drought or periods of flooding. Also, another thing to keep in mind about water is we're not the only ones using it. There's a lot of outside demands for Wyoming water. A good example of that is the Colorado River Compact. which the Green River is a major tributary, and its headwaters are here in Wyoming, and those waters not only provide for agricultural development here in the state of Wyoming, but also provide water to places like Phoenix, Las Vegas, Los Angeles. And it just so happens that the Colorado River Compact that governs that particular drainage, they over-allotted the amount of water that was available, and they're now talking about reallocating that. And believe me, back in the 1920s, I think Wyoming could hold its own against Los Angeles. We had, Phoenix just starting out, and Las Vegas wasn't even thought of back then, but now you have these very large cities that demand this water as well. So now, I remember at the University of Wyoming, in front of the College of Engineering building, there's a saying carved above the door there that says, "Strive on, the control of nature is won, not given," implying that engineering and science will be able to help us to subdue the earth as was commanded in Genesis. But for over 100 years, various settlers, private water companies, and the federal government strove to win control over our water resources. Yet in many ways, nature refuses to fully submit to our human endeavors, allowing us to completely win the contest, or denying us to completely win the contest. In my opinion, water resources and management will continue to alter Wyoming's economy, society, and culture for many generations to come. So, thank you.
All right, let me check that. Is that too loud? How about volume? How does that happen?
There's no volume that you have access to.
Okay.
Can you move your microphone down, maybe?
Move my-
I've got a big voice, so I really. How would that be for? Now you're not on the phone, now it's out there.
Put it back where it was. I'll just bring your volume down a little bit.
She's gonna. So how's this? Now she's got you off. It's okay, it's good for Ed? It's good. And I'm gonna use my big girl voice. All right.
She's got one.
I got it from some people I know. So, knowing the kind of quality of infrastructure look we were gonna get from Jeremy, I wanted to start us with the title of Becoming Water Guardians. And the idea that in trying to think about a spiritual relationship to water, what does water mean? How might we be in a relationship with water? That we're really facing the spiritual opportunity of a lifetime. So, you all are in a unique moment, and you have an opportunity, and I hope it feels real and daily and communal. But I'm going to start here. You can go ahead. Thinking about baptism, and this is one of my favorites of the prayers. We thank you, Almighty God, for the gift of water. Over it, the Holy Spirit moved in the beginning of creation. Through it, you led the children of Israel out of their bondage in Egypt into the land of promise. In it, your son Jesus received the baptism of John and was anointed by the Holy Spirit as the Messiah, the Christ, to lead us through his death and resurrection from the bondage of sin into everlasting life. We thank you, Father, for the water of baptism. In it, we are buried with Christ in his death. By it, we share in his resurrection. Through it, we are reborn by the Holy Spirit. And in a prayer like that, cosmos through the what should you do every day and through what is the significance of your death for your community. That water will be related to where you come from, what should you do, what is the meaning of your death. It is that central to the Christian universe. So that's a pretty big deal. There are other traditions as well for which water is also that essential. And this is in a recent article. Right now we're working in a really wonderful time where Indigenous scholarship on not simply raising Indigenous voices into an ongoing discussion about water, but actually reorienting the categories of thought in ways that a different way of looking at the world provides you with a different set of categories. So in this case, for the Yukon Nations, and I'll just note here, this is an article co-written by Nicole Wilson and Jody Easter. It's in the journal Environment and Planning. And I'm going to mention that. Environment and planning sounds a fair bit like some of what Jeremy told us, in that those people working on infrastructure at the scale, for instance, of a Canadian province are interested now in what are Indigenous relationships to and knowledge about water. Because if we are going to plan, we have a history after settler colonialism that has left Indigenous peoples very vulnerable, oftentimes without access to good water. And in wanting then to make right what is planning, it would include starting with an Indigenous perspective on what is our relationship to water. Because maybe they had something right. And in fact, we know there has been something wrong in some of the commodification of water, in terms of who's got it, and are we planning for a future where the future of animals and children will also have it. So, for Yukon First Nations, water is a living entity with the person-like quality of agency referred to as spirit. Now this is exactly where my work in comparative study of religions is not just how is the cosmos set up, but what model of personhood you find in different traditions. And in this case, water as one of your persons. And that's because water is a morally efficacious being. Water saves lives. Water gives lives. Water is one of your morally efficacious kin in a relationship to this earth. And the word spirit has largely been the word used across many Indigenous traditions to describe the agency of the creation. There is grass spirit, there is tree spirit, there is water spirit, there is an animated agency that produces moral efficacy to the degree that if you are a human who does not behave well, who does not behave as a morally efficacious being, you're not a person. Give me a tree who is a non-human person any day. Because if you human have not elevated yourself to morally efficacious action, you're no longer a person. Persons will act with moral efficacy. So, from this perspective, water not only enables human life by meeting physical needs, but water is life or alive. mentioned. And then for the Ipsalica, or the crow, this is an image of Linda Bulltail, and this is before she had her stroke. And so it's quite beautiful to me to remember this was probably in the year 2012 when we were doing Return to Fort Huff's Father up on Hart Mountain. And when she gave her prayer about women's relationship to the earth during that ceremony, not only did she end up in tears, but many people there ended up in tears. And she was speaking in Crow, and there was something so powerful about the place she went in her prayer, that there were many people also moved to tears. And I'm thinking of tears as water right now. And that after her prayer, one of the things she told me is that she felt like there was 40 people behind her. And so that when she finished her prayer, the first thing she did was to look behind her. And so I do think that this was one of those breakthrough moments. And the tears, which are one of those things that move from our inside to our outside to tell about emotion and connection, were one of those signals. And for the crow, one of the gifts of Hart Mountain is the gift of tears. And if you are a morally efficacious being, if you have shown yourself to be worthy, perhaps through fasting, perhaps through flesh offerings, and you ask for this gift, if you receive it, it washes your eyes so that you can see the supernatural energy at work in the world. And so with the gift of tears, you now know what are clouds doing, where are animals moving, which feather do I need for my horse for a successful battle? That the material world, you will now start seeing its energetic nature, its spirit. So recently, when we had that cold snap, and there was a lot of fog around, and what I love about fog here is, so unlike Middle Earth are we, that when I see fog, I feel like something wonderful could happen, and perhaps something green could grow. But, so here's the fog beneath Hart Mountain, and there it is beside the Carters, which the crow would call White-Tip Bear Mountain. And I took the pole specifically in the picture because the pole is coming from the dam and the energy that we get from that water. So the idea that we are tied in to that electrical pole, as well as any of the beauty of the snow and mists of the mountain. The frozen ice was at my feet, and of course it's marked there by those automobiles that are our eternal traveling buddies. But you can see in this lowest left one, if you look close, the kind of lattice that water structure builds. And it's just beautiful. And who doesn't want to step on those and hear the crunch? Then to the right, we've got cedar and rattlesnake. And again, with the frozen on the below us, the sage, the snow at the top. And then finally to the right, to me, that it just had to, there's something Calvary about that power line. And there is my dog, which is God spelled backwards. So that's my religious picture. All right. Now, I want to talk now and bring us into the opportunity of a lifetime and what it would mean to have a spiritual relationship with water. So about once a month, I go to my buddy who collates once a week. I can't take it once a week, I take it once a month. Collates what's happening in terms of climate change. And so this is go, I'm gonna go, I'm gonna go, and I'm gonna look at it, and I'm gonna face it. And so these are from, I think, last Thursday. And I'm gonna even make you guys go a little bit here, and I've gotta look closer. Climate change is changing the cradle of civilization to a grave. Where civilization emerged between the Tigris and Euphrates, climate change is poisoning the land and emptying the villages. Turkey, on the precipice of climate disaster, as lakes dry and forests burn. The drought in Guadalajara Basin forces to restrict water to 4.3 million people. In the Alps, climate change is turning glaciers into lakes. Glacial lake outbursts are no longer a distant threat, but a reality. Shock, despair, anger. French winemakers reveal the emotional impact of this year's harvest. Deaths in Poland as Storm Aurora wreaks havoc across Europe. Severe storms with tornadoes threaten the central U.S. this weekend. A bomb cyclone with hurricane-like strength and an atmospheric river will coincide Saturday night and unleash flooding rains, wet snow, strong winds across the western U.S. And then finally, here is that atmospheric river. And so when we think about that baptism prayer, one of the new components for a cosmology will be things like atmospheric rivers. We now have water so dense traveling in the atmosphere that they're describing it as an atmospheric river. So we are altering literally how the firmament exists. And then there are the cars trying to drive through what happens after that. So then we return. And so for me, the spiritual opportunity of a lifetime is becoming water guardians. And you might recognize the term water guardian or water protector from the Standing Rock. The people who were part of organizing that resistance did so because they understood themselves to be water guardians and that they needed to fight against their tradition's prophecy that a black snake would ruin their water. And that black snake, they felt like, was the pipeline. So when I think about what's it take to do my dip every 2 weeks into climate issues, what's it take to live here, now, celebrating the sparkle of dew on the sagebrush in the morning. The simple things I do include trying to start my day and end my day with a glass of water. Even before coffee. Even after wine. Just to restore to that. To connect myself to both local water protectors and this national, at least awareness of water protectors. And I thought I would ask you all what advice you all have for how one lives with this opportunity. In part, there have been people who talk about our time as though to talk or write about nature is to write a eulogy. There are people who speak about this time as a time for becoming monks.
wonder if we could just start with a minute from both of our speakers to respond to each other.
Respond to each other, let's do that.
I mean, not to put you on the spot.
Right.
Well, I see we already drove Wally out, so we're making some progress. Very interesting, Mary, and I think you're absolutely right. Water is just going to become more and more of an issue, and it kind of scares me that we boil these issues, these very serious issues that are going to play a significant role for generations to come down to political rhetoric. It really kind of concerns me we're not having these serious conversations about what are we going to do as some of these rivers are drying up. For example, right now they're wondering if Lake Powell or Lake Mead is going to cease to exist in the next few decades to come here, which has some very serious implications, not just for the cities downstream, but for the headwater states as well. And it strikes me, I don't know how we really got to this point, because going back to Theodore Roosevelt's administration, in 1908 he hosted a conservation gathering, conservation conference, and he invited people that you would never imagine being together in one room in the political scheme of things today. So his main political opponent, Roosevelt's main political opponent, was always William Jennings Bryan. And William Jennings Bryan was in this conference. He was right there with Andrew Carnegie, one of the wealthiest men of America, and the world for that matter. And these people were having serious conversations. The transcripts are just incredible. And there's no political rhetoric. And they're listening to each other, trying to understand, because I think at that time they realized if we don't take care of these valuable resources, not just on a spiritual level, but economically, we're going to be in a world of hurt. And I'm really afraid we're heading in that direction. It's going to hit us sooner than we imagine.
And one of the things in that article from the Yukon, the First Nations people, one of the things I thought in preparing, Jeremy, was how much I would like to work with you on something that marries that planning and the ethos of water. That could not only be an interesting article, but that I wonder about the Center of the West and actually a larger themed exhibit or something that tried by both restoring indigenous perspectives on water, but being the place where we get to think seriously about it. And there should be songs written and paintings done.
I'm sure there are songs written.
Yeah, truly.
Any questions? I just want to acknowledge that we have two locals here. Somebody from Powell and somebody from Cody that grew up and have these issues in their hearts and in their intellects. And I have to mention this because my husband's on the fall board, and they are developing reservoirs out in the McCullough Peaks for the wild horses. They have plans to develop 10 reservoirs in 5 years for the horses out there, the wild horses. So this all connects somehow. Oh, I just also want to mention a book I read, Water Knife. Have you read it? Water Knife. And it is about the shortage of water in the U.S. and how people are killing for that. Yeah, it's going to happen. Did you get enough to eat? Oh, we got a picture. We got a question. Ellen.
Yeah, so thinking about the personhood of the rivers, one thing that comes to mind is
So I think that's also part of why I think we have the opportunity of a lifetime right now, is to actually remit what it is, and that I have no doubt that all the rest of the infrastructure is rock solid. It's got law, it's got governors, it's got everything you need, but that this other piece of how we relate, I see a lot of room for that.
And I think with water, regardless of our personal connections to bodies of water, or if it's just a matter of turning the spigot on, I think water is the one resource that unifies everybody in the world. We're not going to be here if we lose our water. And that doesn't mean, that applies to people who just turn on the spigot and expect the technology's always going to deliver that water. And it also means the people that are going to the lakes and have that deep spiritual connection there. So I think water, unlike other political issues or conservation issues, is something that you can very clearly get the people and say, look, when this is gone, we're gone.
Amen.
Just thinking of coming over here watching have you ever seen the Mad Max Road Warrior show? And the people, they leave the village, they flee the village after tricking the bad guys by filling the gas truck full of water and sending Mel Gibson off with that. And then the settlers load up all the water tanks with gasoline and escape. And I'm wondering, how far did those people get into the desert with water tanks full of gasoline? I think Mel Gibson had a better chance of surviving with the fuel truck full of water. But, getting people to focus on it, water's a lot more valuable than gasoline.
We're so bad in this country at looking forward. We're so focused on now and what we want now rather than thinking very far down the road or even planning.
Well, but let me counter that too, to say that I think there are a lot of people that part of what our economic structure, part of what capitalism has us doing, is looking ahead to the future value of money. And there are people right now investing in our water. So they are planning that as this becomes rarer and it gets more expensive, they will be the ones with it. So I want to say, yeah, we also do look ahead. And then, but that looking ahead is looking ahead with the incentive of capitalism is to corner a market on a resource. And that means you want to get as much of it as you can before anyone else can have it. So that ethos, I think, will be very strong, but it will be on that short-sighted version. So it is the problem you're describing, but I want to say there are people playing the long game with water.
And that was John Wesley Powell's greatest fear, was that if private corporations end up controlling all the water, we're in trouble.
And so the social entrepreneurs who can revalue it as kin, or maybe you don't have to use a word like that might scare the pants off of people, but as common good, part of our commons, and so the just distribution of water in the future that might be something to work for.
I don't know if there are people who don't have questions because they're feeling like I'm feeling right now, which is I've just got too much to mull over from what I learned from both of you tonight. And one of the things is the first three ways you talked about that people irrigated or brought water to bring life, the settlers did, to the land, rather than simply moving with the flow of the water, which is my sense of more of the native folks, and the differences between the entrepreneurs who were, had this dream and apparently didn't make money on their dream, though they had hoped to, trying to get the government to come in and help, and then the way that sort of the community way. And I'm just really taken with the LDS Church, coming out as a group and working together for the good of the whole, that the individuals are willing to sacrifice for something larger than themselves. And so I'm thinking I've heard, not just from you, Mary, but also from you, Jeremy, some stories that are really good news stories and full of hope in the midst of changes and challenges to our water, our clean water, our water supply in a changing planet. But I don't have a question, I'm sorry. I'm one of those horrible people that I hate when I'm standing in Mary Ann's spot. It's like, I don't really have a question. I just wanted to speak too.
I have a question. How can we promote clean water? I mean, as a group, what can we do as individuals?
Can I tag a question on to the end of that real fast?
Sure.
Okay, this is innocent James, but
Take your mask off. We can't hear you.
okay, just with citizen science water quality monitoring, I've heard it's like against the law here. I don't know what though, so that's my tag.
Oh, that's unholy.
What?
Yeah, that like the Department of Environment doesn't accept citizen science reports of environmental water quality, yet other states they recognize that. That's just how does citizens get involved with the water?
Yeah, there was, the big court case about ranchers trying to keep people off testing the streams to see if the livestock were polluting the waters. That's, I don't know. It just seems like, and forgive me for saying this in the church, but you got to scare the hell out of people. And I think that was one thing that really led the progressives, is that they really seriously believed if you didn't manage the natural resources of America, the world would become a desert. And there were scientists that actually argued that the Sahara Desert at one time was this lush green land that was ruined and then became a desert. And that spooked people, and it got them, upset, and they wanted to move forward and make sure the communal good was protected. And it just kind of seems interesting that I think we always kind of feel safe that science is going to save us, and it's kind of ironic we freak out, we're not worried. Well, we worry about drinking tap water, so we buy a bunch of water in plastic bottles and then pollute the oceans with the plastic. It's just, you really got to scare people, I think. You got to make them realize this is pretty serious. So.
And my take on that one is that I'm part of a settler colonial place that removed Native Americans. And so I have their stories now to connect with. And it would be through ways, right now, High Country News has covered the ways that the Apsalica are studying their water and trying to restore with their kids relationships to water through story, through kid science, citizen science. So I think that that's my eye on what would just distribution and working toward environmental justice. It would be, how are we tied into the Apsalica and their struggles with water? Because the indigenous peoples will be the one with the least infrastructure for clean water, the greatest devastation when flooding comes, those kinds of issues. So that's where I would point, is to those connecting our memory of water with theirs.
I use water every day. I don't think about it. I mean, I turn on the tap and I want my water colder, so I let the water run for a minute and I don't think I'm wasting good water. I'm just thinking I'm getting the cold water that I want. And I treasure the fact that I can do that. When I do laundry, I did 2 loads of laundry today. And that takes a lot of, I don't think about it. I didn't think, gosh, I thought about it when I had to carry the water from the river. I mean, when I lived in a village in Alaska and depended on my body and my muscles, but I'd love it right now in my 85th year that I can turn on this faucet and the water's gonna come. I really, it's not a conscious thing with me. And that may be a problem. And maybe my daughter will help me solve that problem. You know, but it's unconscious. I don't deliberately think I'm going to ignore this water that I'm running. I just think I want the water a certain temperature and I'm going to turn on my faucet. So it's ignorance or it's not thinking or...
One of the things we know about from social sciences is that if you were to ask people how much they know about their water use, they would feel quite confident and they would be quite wrong.
Well, that's me.
And so one of the things I'm doing is trying to do a survey that goes out and it's with a team. We call ourselves Cultivating Community Preparedness down at UW. And I'm trying to write questions that would allow people to report on their relationship to water. So that it's, in terms of understanding our perceptions of water, I have the feeling that there is something about indigenous perceptions of water as kin and relationship. And what any good old white consumer settler person, if they slow down or listen to the baptism service, would actually report. Like that it is life, it is fundamental to a divine cosmos. And so if you can get some of those relationship questions into a thing that otherwise knows how to ask you about price, knows how to ask you about your water bill.
Include hot or cold water in your questionnaire.
And expand.
You use hot water in different ways and cold water in different ways. And we use them in different ways.
Thanks.
Somebody else had a question? Somebody had a hand up?
I was going to ask if the present irrigation scheme, the siphon canals, are economically viable, or is that another government subsidy of a special waste route?
You look at the history, and you could say the irrigation project here was one of the biggest subsidized projects in the Bighorn Basin. There's no doubt about it. There's just no way the Buffalo Bill Dam would have been completed without federal assistance. What concerns me is just through my brief lifetime here, seeing the amount of all this farmland that was developed at a great expense being subdivided now. And you think about, George Beck is probably rolling over in his grave thinking it cost us $22 an acre to irrigate this subdivision. So, and it's changing. It's changing things, and the water demands are shifting too. So now we're going from, okay, as time goes on and more people get out of agriculture, municipal use of water is going to become more important. And and that takes a toll as well. I challenge all of you, go get your city bill, because my kids help me understand how much water we use. Every time they run in the shower, I'm thinking that city bill is going to come back. It's gonna be going up there, so, but I think starting to ask yourself, how much water do I use on a monthly basis? It's, you know, look at that amount of gallons that you're using in your home, and it's shocking. It's shocking. It really is.
Kind of ruined my good night glass of water, which I do too. Because I let the water run a long time ago.
Just like I said, if you're in the West, whiskey is for drinking, water's for fighting, so.
Any more questions? This has been fabulous.
You bet.
Thank you, Tim.
Yes.